They called her Danny the dinosaur. Nobody knew why. Nobody asked. She just refilled saline bags and faded into the fluorescent hum of Seattle General's night shift like she was part of the infrastructure itself. But he had no idea who was standing 6 feet from him in the supply room at 0300 hours. She had no idea that 48 hours from now, 2 Black Hawks would land in the ambulance bay demanding her by name and call sign. The truth didn't just lurk beneath her scrubs, it lived in the scars tracing her collarbone, in hands steady enough to hold a human heart, in the muscle memory of a woman who once ran emergency triage in buildings that no longer existed. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended his career. The fluorescent lights of Seattle General in Norfolk hum their endless mechanical song at 0300 hours. Danielle Ross moves through the 4th floor ER with the precision of someone who has learned not to be seen. 3 years she has worked this shift. 3 years of refilling saline bags, changing linens, staying out of the way of doctors who don't make eye contact with floor nurses. She wears the invisibility like armor. Her badge reads D. Ross, RN, the smallest possible truth. The important details are filed somewhere in personnel records that no one reads. Not anymore. Not since she requested night shift exclusively, since she took this position after everything else fell away, since she decided that healing people quietly was enough. It had to be enough. The supply cart rattles beneath her hands as she guides it down the corridor. The smell of antiseptic hangs in the air like a ghost, mixed with something underneath it, the metallic hint of blood from a trauma bay 2 rooms down, the bitter sting of something burning. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm from behind a curtain bay. She doesn't flinch. She has heard worse. Much worse. When she reaches for a morphine carriage to verify stock levels, her hand trembles slightly. Just a fraction of a second. A muscle memory that hasn't forgotten what it means to need narcotics for people screaming in the dark. She grips the handle tighter, pressing the tremor into stillness. No one is watching. No one is ever watching. Dr. Ashford breezes past without acknowledgement, his white coat catching the cold institutional light as if it belongs to him personally. His shoes are Italian. His watch catches the fluorescent glare, something expensive, something that costs more than Danielle makes in a month. He moves with the careless confidence of a man who has never been told no, the kind of authority that comes not from knowing more but from knowing that people assume he does. Danielle's jaw tightens. Just for a moment. Just enough that someone trained to read micro-expressions would catch it. But Dr. Ashford has never been trained to read her. He has never trained himself to notice anyone he doesn't need to notice. What he doesn't see when he glances her direction is that she was watching him. Specifically, 3 days ago. Specifically, at 02 for 5 hours, when she had restocked his office supply cabinet and found the discrepancies. 1 bottle of morphine marked as administered to a patient code that no longer existed in the system. Then another. Then another. The bottles were in his personal drawer. The signatures on the narcotics log didn't match his handwriting. They weren't even close. She knows what opioid diversion looks like. She has held the hands of addicted soldiers in recovery facilities. She recognizes the signs the way other people recognize faces they've known for years. The supply room door hisses shut behind her. The walls are painted that particular shade of institutional beige that hospitals use to neutralize human emotion. Danielle moves down the aisle, her fingers trailing across the labels. Saline. Dextrose. Sodium chloride. Her movements are practiced enough that she could do this in her sleep. And sometimes, on the worst nights, she almost does. The real sting of it is that he thinks she's afraid of him. Last week, when he had raised his voice over a patient chart, she had flinched. Automatically. Unconsciously. It was a reflex from somewhere deeper than thought, the kind of thing that happens when your nervous system remembers that loud voices in certain contexts meant incoming fire. She had hated herself for it, but she had let him see it. Let him see the flinch. Because a woman who flinches is not a woman who is dangerous. A woman who flinches is just a floor nurse. Her hands held the stainless steel cart with the kind of steadiness that came from years of practice. Years of practice in sandstorms. Years of hands that had cracked ribs open and clamped bleeders while rounds fell like hail. But those hands didn't exist here. Those hands belonged to a different woman in a different life. This version of Danielle Ross kept her hands gentle and her voice soft. The patient rolling past her on a gurney made her breath catch. Just for a half second. Just enough that her fingers gripped the saline bag a little tighter. It was the jacket. The faded cloth visible beneath the trauma blanket. And sewn into the lining, a unit patch. She could see it from 8 feet away. The same patch that had once been sewn into her own jacket lining. The same insignia she had worn the day she pulled a 6-year-old boy from a collapsed building in Ramadi, 20 years ago, while the structure fell in around them like broken teeth. She turned away. Finished restocking the cart. Moved on. The shift continued its relentless rhythm. Monitors beeped. Rubber gloves snapped like gunshots. Someone called for a crash cart. The controlled chaos of an ER at night, where the lights were too bright and the decisions were too urgent and the people who made them usually didn't know all the facts. Danielle worked through it like she had worked through every shift for 3 years. Invisible. Careful. Quiet. At 0417 hours, Dr. Ashford was in the staff room. The overhead intercom crackled to life. His voice came through, amplified and echoing down 3 floors of corridor. Danny the dinosaur to the east wing. Danny the dinosaur to the east wing, stat. The silence that followed was thicker than it should have been. She heard laughter from the residents' lounge. She heard a nurse suppress a snort. She heard the moment when everyone who had heard it understood that it was meant to humiliate, and that humiliation had a specific target. Danielle kept her eyes on the suture kit she was organizing. Her jaw tightened. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice, when she finally moved toward the east wing, didn't waver. Copy that, she said quietly to no one in particular. Heading east. The nickname would have landed differently on someone else. On someone who hadn't learned to wear her composure like a second skin. On someone who hadn't spent decades learning that the best armor is the kind people can't see you wearing. She moved through the corridor with the same invisible precision she brought to everything else. The dinosaur comment would spread. It would stick. In a week, no one would remember that her name was Danielle. They would just know her as the floor nurse who flinched at raised voices, who didn't argue, who accepted her place in the hierarchy without complaint. What he didn't know, as she passed his office on the way to the East Wing, was that she had already documented the discrepancies in the narcotics log. Specific bottles. Specific times. Specific handwriting samples. The documentation was careful and detailed and completely inadmissible in a formal investigation, but it was proof. The kind of proof that someone trained in chain of custody procedures would recognize immediately. The kind of proof that Major Danielle Ross, 3 tours in Ramadi with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had learned to gather so thoroughly that it could never be disputed. But here, tonight, at 0417 hours on a Tuesday morning, she was just Danny the dinosaur. Just a floor nurse. Just someone who didn't matter enough to be spoken to with her actual name. She didn't flinch. Not this time. She only felt the careful, controlled burn of someone who had learned to weaponize her patience, who had learned to wait, who had learned that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. The East Wing was waiting. The night stretched ahead. And somewhere in the distance, if you listened carefully, you might have heard the faint sound of rotor blades on a horizon no one else was watching. The emergency room doors slid open at 1847 hours, and the paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man whose chart was already marked with red flags before his body crossed the threshold. Psychiatric hold. Incomplete records. No emergency contact. The patient's lips were sealed, literally, trauma-induced selective mutism, the intake nurse noted with clinical distance, and his bleeding was internal, spreading like a dark map under his ribs where a construction accident had crushed him against rebar 3 hours prior. His oxygen saturation read 89%. His blood pressure was already on the slide downward. He needed surgery. He needed it now. But what he needed most was a doctor willing to take him. Dr. Ashford appeared in the trauma bay exactly 90 seconds after the stretcher arrived. He was the chief of surgery, which meant his word moved through Seattle General like a command through a chain of command, which meant everyone in that room straightened when he entered. He glanced at the chart. He glanced at the patient. He looked at the patient's sealed lips, the mutism, and something shifted in his expression, a small calculation happening behind his eyes, the way a predator measures whether prey is worth the hunt. 90 seconds. That was all it took. He turned to the attending resident and said, "Insufficient psychiatric clearance. I don't operate on cases with liability issues. Get him cleared by psychiatry first, then we'll reassess." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply turned and walked out, his white coat moving like a sail catching wind. Dr. Patel was next. She examined the patient for 40 seconds, her stethoscope moving across his chest with practiced efficiency, and then she shook her head at the resident. "Too high risk for my surgical schedule. Too many complications, too many unknowns. I'm not comfortable with this one." She was already moving away, already reaching for the next chart, already done with him. Dr. Chen followed the same pattern. She read the psychiatric flag, looked at the silent patient with something approaching pity mixed with administrative burden, and said, "Administrative complications, sorry. You'll need to sort the psychiatric clearance first." Dr. Wolf and Dr. Martinez completed the cascade, each one citing bureaucratic reasons, each one protecting their own schedules and liability profiles, each one confirming what the system had already decided: this patient wasn't worth the paperwork. 5 doctors. 5 refusals. The man on the stretcher lay still, his chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of someone whose oxygen was already running out. Danielle stood in the corner of the trauma bay where she'd been checking the crash cart, and she watched all 5 refusals happen in sequence like a choreography of abandonment. Her jaw tightened. That was all. Her hands didn't move, her face didn't flush, her voice didn't crack. Just a small tightening of the muscles along her jaw, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking for it. But she was looking. She was always looking. And what she saw in that patient's eyes when he locked onto hers for just a fraction of a second, that wasn't fear. That was recognition. Something in the way he turned his head when the stretcher entered the room, something in the angle of his shoulders, something in the military-precise way he was controlling his breathing despite the pain. These were not things that happened in civilians. 2 hours later, the overhead PA system crackled to life with the particular tone that meant someone was about to be humiliated, and Danielle's hand paused mid-motion over a medication cart. "Danny the dinosaur to Central Supply. Danny the dinosaur, your prehistoric skills are needed in the basement." Laughter rippled across 3 floors. She heard it in the background of phone calls, saw it in the quick glances from other nurses, felt it land exactly where Dr. Ashford had intended it to land. But she was a woman who had been called far worse things by people with far more authority than a hospital's chief of surgery. She finished hanging the 4 bag, took one measured breath, let a single tear escape down her right cheek, and wiped it without breaking stride or stopping her work. The tear was information, data about pressure, about the cost of silence, about the calculation she was running in real time. Then she moved toward the supply closet like she was moving toward anything else on her shift. Dr. Ashford was waiting for her there, blocking the narrow doorway, his presence filling the small space between the shelves like a threat that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of the hospital's afternoon shift transition, doors closing, footsteps, the normal machinery of a place that would protect the competent and devour the weak. "I know you saw me that night," he said quietly, stepping closer so his voice wouldn't carry. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, the kind of voice a man uses when he's certain he holds all the cards. "You've been watching the medication logs, haven't you? Noticing things that aren't your business to notice." He was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, expensive, the kind that costs more than most people's rent, and underneath it, the smell of someone who never worried about consequences. "Here's what's going to happen." You keep your mouth shut about what you think you saw, or I'll have you fired for incompetence by Friday. I'll make sure every hospital in this region knows your name as a liability. Do we understand each other?" Danielle's voice came out calm as still water in a winter lake. "I understand exactly who you are." She didn't raise it. She didn't inflect it. She just stated it like she was reading a vital sign. Dr. Ashford's face tightened. He wasn't used to people who didn't flinch, who didn't beg, who didn't promise silence and beg for their jobs back. He stepped back, and in that moment, Danielle moved past him and into the supply closet like he was no longer worth her attention. Behind her, she heard his breath release, sharp and angry, the sound of a man who realized the threat he'd issued hadn't landed. The sound of a man adjusting his approach. Yesterday, during the afternoon shift change, Dr. Ashford had made his move. The parking lot was crowded, 20 staff members moving between cars, the incoming shift arriving just as the outgoing shift departed, the perfect audience for what he'd planned. He'd found her there with his voice pitched to carry without shouting, that particular tone of authority that makes people stop and listen. "Danielle, effective immediately, you're reassigned to janitorial liaison. Someone needs to coordinate the night cleaning crew, and frankly, your clinical skills have plateaued. I think this might be a better use of your talents." He'd handed her a mop schedule printed that morning, his smile like a wolf showing its teeth. 20 staff members had watched as the woman they'd seen execute a difficult full line on a septic patient was handed a list of floors that needed cleaning. Nobody had spoken. Nobody had moved. Dr. Ashford had turned and walked back toward the building, and the message had been clear: this is what happens when you become a problem. Now it was 1900 hours, and the mute veteran was still in the ER, still inoperably bleeding, still abandoned by 5 doctors and a system that had already decided he wasn't worth saving. Danielle approached his room from the hallway, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had made a decision at the molecular level. Through the door window, the patient's eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, something shifted in the air like a frequency changing. His pupils dilated. His breath rate increased. He lifted his head slightly, and that's when she saw it, the faded unit patch sewn inside his jacket lining, visible where the medics had cut through the fabric to access his wounds. The patch was so worn that the unit designation was barely visible, but she knew it instantly. The same unit. The same patch. The same war, 20 years ago, in buildings that were now rubble and dust and the kinds of memories that don't fade because they're not meant to. Dr. Ashford materialized in the doorway between her and the patient's room, his presence materializing like something she should have been expecting. "This patient is off limits to floor staff," he said flatly. "Especially to you. I think your new assignment keeps you fairly occupied." He smiled that smile again, the one that showed he understood exactly what he was doing, exactly how much this moment would cost her. "Step back." She was already moving away, already understanding the calculation he'd made, that she was isolated enough now, broken enough in the eyes of the hospital hierarchy, that he could stop her without consequence. Danielle took one measured breath. She let a single tear escape down her cheek without breaking eye contact with Ashford, without flinching at the wall of pressure he was throwing at her. Then she spoke. "I've treated worse injuries with less equipment in buildings that no longer exist." Her voice was flat, informational, the kind of voice a person uses when they're describing something true that no amount of authority can deny. The words landed between them like a scar being reopened. Ashford's face hardened. He stepped closer, blocking the doorway completely now, his hand on the frame. "Leave. Now. Or I'll have security escort you out permanently." But his hand was shaking. Just slightly. Just enough that Danielle could see it. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It triggered the beginning of his descent. At 01 for 5 hours, the basement supply room hummed with the low frequency of industrial freezers. Danielle was cataloging saline bags into their assigned slots, janitorial liaison work that would have seemed absurd 2 days ago, when the overhead code alert cut through the fluorescent silence like a scalpel. Code blue. ICU. Bay 7. The veteran's bay. Her hands moved before thought could catch up. 3 seconds to the stairwell. The elevator wouldn't answer her badge anymore, not since Ashford had locked clinical floors against her access. For flights of stairs meant 48 steps up, and she knew the exact count because she'd measured it years ago in a different war, different building, different life. Her legs carried her through muscle memory that transcended time zones and decade-old scars. By the time her boots hit the ICU tiles, the monitor was already screaming. The attending resident, a young man named Cho, maybe 30, with hands that hadn't yet learned to betray him, was already at the bedside doing chest compressions. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm was correct. The desperation was all wrong. His face had the color of someone watching a house burn and holding only a cup of water. On call is 40 minutes out, someone said. Danielle didn't recognize the voice. Stuck on IU-95. No one answered. Cho kept compressing. The monitor showed a flat line, and flat lines didn't argue. Flat lines didn't negotiate. Flat lines only counted down to the moment when flat lines became permanent. Danielle moved to the window. Through the reinforced glass, she could see the veteran clearly. No longer mute in this moment because his body was screaming louder than any word could. His oxygen saturation had been marginal an hour ago, sitting at 94% on 15 liters of supplemental O2, the kind of breathing that happened when lungs were filling with blood instead of air. Now the monitor showed it dropping like a stone. 85. 78. 69. Each number was a door slamming shut. The chest tube. She could see it in the visual sweep her eyes made, the position wrong, kinked at an angle that shouldn't have been physically possible. The drainage system on the floor beside the bed showed what should have remained inside a human thorax. Hundreds of milliliters of blood. Fresh blood. Still warm blood. The kind that meant something had catastrophically failed in the last 90 seconds. Dr. Ashford's office phone went to voicemail. Again. His cell went straight to a busy signal that felt deliberately constructed. The voice on the intercom tried reaching him 3 times. 3 times met silence, and silence was Ashford's favorite tool because it couldn't be cited in incident reports. Through the window, Cho's eyes lifted from the veteran's chest. His gaze found hers. Found her outside the glass. Found her locked out by protocol and policy and a director of surgery who had made his position abundantly clear 4 hours ago when he'd told her the word unauthorized had never felt more final. The look in Cho's eyes was the look of a man watching water rise and understanding for the first time that rescue might not be coming. It was the look of a drowning person reaching. Danielle glanced at her badge. Still deactivated. Still powerless. The electronic lock on the ICU door would respond to her badge the way a corpse responds to argument, it wouldn't. But fire doors didn't discriminate. Fire doors opened for anyone, because fire didn't care about jurisdiction or chain of command. Fire doors opened because human beings had decided once, decades ago, that some emergencies transcended administrative authority. She found the alarm pull station 12 feet down the corridor. Red box. Glass cover. The message underneath read, "Break in case of emergency." This was emergency. The pull handle came away smooth. No hesitation. No second guessing. Just the kind of decision that happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the kind that men and women made every day in places where buildings fell and buildings burned and the only law that mattered was the law that separated the living from the dead. The alarm screamed. Every door in the ICU unlocked simultaneously, their electronic locks surrendering to the override. Red light strobed. The sound filled the space like physical force, like the rotor wash from a Black Hawk that knew no geography and recognized no walls. Danielle pushed through into Bay 7. The crash cart was positioned exactly where crash carts lived, and she reached it with the kind of direct path that came from having done this before in places where the cart couldn't be more than 3 steps away because 3 steps was the difference between salvageable and lost. The scalpel from the surgical tray caught the light. Number 15 blade, sterile, sharp enough to separate tissue with less pressure than a whisper. She'd used one like it in Ramadi, in a building that no longer had a roof, with a child whose name she'd learned in the 48 hours after extraction. She'd used one like it in the back of a Humvee when a corpsman had taken shrapnel that couldn't wait for a forward operating base 2 miles away. Cho was still compressing. His rhythm was starting to deteriorate, fatigue beginning to alter the precision of his movements, the way panic looked when it wore a doctor's coat. Behind him, 2 nurses were readying equipment. One of them, Thompson, name tag visible, looked up at Danielle and something in her expression shifted. Recognition, maybe. Or maybe just relief at the arrival of someone whose hands didn't look like they belonged to someone who'd never done this before. Blood in the chest tube, Danielle said. Her voice had changed. Not louder. Smaller, actually. Precise. The kind of voice that came from a part of her that remembered how sound traveled in enclosed spaces and how clarity mattered when machines were the only thing standing between someone and nothing. Tubes kinked at the mid-axillary line. Clot formation or direct dislodgement. He's losing pressure. Cho nodded without stopping compressions. Can't get him to OR. Ashford's unreachable. On-call is. I know, Danielle said. Not a request. Not a question. A statement that moved past explanation into action. She set the scalpel on the sterile field and looked at the veteran's exposed chest. The monitor showed oxygen saturation at 52. 51. Dropping like someone had cut the line holding it to the sky. A field thoracotomy couldn't wait for Ashford to answer his phone. A field thoracotomy couldn't wait for the on-call surgeon to navigate Norfolk traffic. A field thoracotomy was the answer you gave when the answer was no longer a question but a clock counting down to the moment when no answer mattered anymore. Hold compressions for 30 seconds, Danielle said. Her hands that had graduated from Special Forces qualification course with instructors' notes about precision and steadiness and the rare quality of not trembling when trembling would be reasonable, moved toward the sterile field. I need a clean field. Thompson, get me the largest bore angiocath you have. And push 1 mil of Epi-4. No one asked who had authorized her. No one asked if her badge allowed this. The alarm was still strobing. The red lights made everything look like it was bleeding. The sounds of the ICU became a background rhythm to the sound of her breathing, steady as someone preparing for surgery in a building where there were no surgeons, only the wounded and the will to keep them breathing. The hiss of the angiocath needle as it found the vein was almost gentle. Almost merciful. Almost like the only sound that mattered in a world where Ashford was unreachable and protocols had become luxury items and the job was exactly what it had always been, the job of keeping human beings alive when everything around you was arguing for the alternative. The scalpel was already in her hand before the thought completed itself. Muscle memory didn't live in thought, it lived in bone, in the architecture of 1,000 practice movements, and Danielle's hands didn't hesitate as she retrieved the blade from the crash cart, the handle familiar as a weapon she'd carried for 20 years. Her scrubs were already soaked. The veteran's chest tube had dislodged at 0200 hours exactly, the monitors screaming their terrible song. 02 sat dropping like a stone through water, 92, 87, 79, 71, and there was no time for protocols or chain of command or the 4 other surgeons who had already walked away from this man's body like he was radioactive. The on-call surgeon was 40 minutes out. Ashford was still unreachable. The attending resident was frozen, standing at the foot of the bed with his hands limp, staring at the monitor as if the numbers might reverse themselves if he watched hard enough. They wouldn't. They never did. Danielle moved past him like he wasn't there. Her hands made the first incision with the precision of someone who had operated in sandstorms, in a field hospital that had been a school building 3 days prior, in conditions where you didn't get a second chance and didn't ask for one. Fourth intercostal space. One clean cut through skin and muscle, the blade singing its small song of resistance as tissue parted. The smell of antiseptic and copper, so much copper, blood already dark and pooling, but her focus was absolute. She wasn't in Norfolk anymore. She was in a collapsed building in Jolan district where a 6-year-old boy was bleeding out under her hands and his heartbeat was the only clock that mattered. That boy had become the man on this stretcher. That boy was why she was here, though nobody in this hospital knew that yet, and maybe they never would. Maybe she'd spend the rest of her life as just a nurse, watching from the margins, and that would be enough. Right now, it had to be enough. The ribs cracked under her fingers with a sound like dry wood breaking, small, terrible, necessary. The retractor spread his chest open, and there it was, the bleeder in his left pulmonary artery, the source of the catastrophic hemorrhage, pulsing blood with each fading heartbeat. O2 sat was 54 now. The monitor beeped its terrible rhythm, 52, 48, 43. Brain death was minutes away. His hippocampus was already starving for oxygen. She'd seen this before in Ramadi, seen the moment when a life started to slip away like water through a hand, and the only response was speed and absolute clarity and the knowledge that hesitation was the same as choosing to let him die. Danielle's hands moved like they were part of the machinery itself. A zero silk suture already in the needle holder, she didn't remember retrieving it, but the memory was there anyway, waiting in her muscle. She clamped the bleeder with surgical precision, the hemostator extension of her arm, not a tool she was using but a limb she'd never lost. The artery tightened. The bleeding slowed. The monitors began their climb, 62, 68, 74, 81. His heart found its rhythm again. His oxygen saturation climbed like a pilot pulling out of a dive. The residency coordinator had backed out of the room entirely. A nurse was standing with her hand over her mouth. But Danielle's hands were steady as surgical lasers, steady as they'd been in a building that no longer existed, steady as they'd been the day she pulled a 6-year-old boy from underneath for tons of concrete and held his heart beating against her chest while artillery shook the walls. At 0212 hours, Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway. He didn't check the monitors. He didn't assess the patient. He didn't ask what had happened or why. His eyes moved from the veteran's open chest to Danielle's blood-soaked scrubs to her hands, and something shifted in his face, shock cycling into calculation cycling into cold rage so complete it seemed to drain the color from his skin. He stepped back into the corridor without a word. His phone was already out. She heard him, voice steady and professional, making for calls in rapid succession, hospital board members first, their names clipped and authoritative, then the chief of staff, then security, then the hospital attorney. Each conversation was identical in structure, a report, not a request, delivered in a tone that made it clear this was already decided. The tone of a man who understood institutional power the way Danielle understood blood loss and airway management, not as a concept but as a lived operational knowledge. While he talked, he was photographing 3 angles of the open chest. 3 shots of Danielle's blood-covered hands. The monitors climbing. The veteran stabilized vital signs. Everything that proved she'd saved him and everything that proved she'd violated every protocol that made Seattle General's lawyers comfortable. The real genius of what came next was the simplicity of it. By 0218 hours, Dr. Ashford had reassigned both nurses who'd witnessed the procedure, one to the satellite clinic across the harbor on night rotation, one to administrative leave for fatigue assessment, both moves executed through the hospital's personnel system with the kind of bureaucratic precision that made them impossible to challenge. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just gone. By 0223 hours, he'd altered the electronic log so they showed Danielle had never entered the ICU that evening, had never accessed the veteran's room, had never authorized anything. Instead, the resident had performed the thoracotomy under phone guidance from the on-call surgeon, who was already the subject of a formal complaint about unauthorized telephone practice. The digital footprint was clean. Verifiable. Plausible enough that it would take a forensic audit to disprove. When security arrived at 0245 hours, Dr. Ashford's voice was measured and professional, the tone of a surgeon explaining a difficult case to concerned family. This woman violated direct orders. Performed unauthorized surgery. Compromised patient safety in a manner that could have resulted in catastrophic contamination or complications. He gestured toward the operating field where blood still dripped from the instrument trays. I want her badge and an immediate escort from the building. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the state medical board for practicing medicine without authorization. The security officers nodded. They'd seen his type before, competent, calm, the kind of authority figure who moved institutional machinery like it was his personal chess set. Danielle turned in her badge at 0300 hours without a word. She didn't defend herself. She didn't mention the veteran stabilizing vitals. She didn't explain that every action she'd taken was the only possible response to human beings in crisis, that protocols meant nothing when someone was bleeding out, that she'd crossed no line that mattered because the only line that mattered was between a person living and a person dead. The badge clattered on the counter in front of the security desk with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. She walked through the lobby past staring staff members, the resident looking away, the nurses whispering, the orderlies suddenly very focused on their stretchers, and she felt the weight of the moment without flinching, without the slightest change in her posture or breathing. Just a nurse who'd made a mistake. Just another healthcare worker who'd tried to play surgeon and gotten caught. The story Ashford had already begun to construct was so much simpler than the truth that it had a kind of elegance to it. Everyone could understand it. Everyone could believe it. Her car was in the northeast corner of the parking garage, slot 147, a 2008 Subaru with a broken taillight and rust blooming along the rocker panels like a slow infection. She sat in the driver's seat at 031 for hours and closed the door with the soft click of finality. The morning was still 3 hours away. The parking garage around her was empty except for the hum of the ventilation system and the sound of rain beginning to fall outside, light and scattered at first, then heavier, than the kind of rain that erased the world beyond 10 feet. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and waited for her hands to stop shaking. They didn't. For the first time in 20 years, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The engine was dead. Battery finally gone. She reached for the key anyway and turned it, nothing, just the slight grind of a starter that had nothing left to give. She turned it again. Nothing. Again. The silence between each failed attempt became a kind of testimony. She didn't have the strength to leave the car. She didn't have the strength to process that she'd just performed a flawless surgical procedure under impossible conditions and saved a man's life and lost her career in the same 20-minute window. That the decision was already made. That Ashford's competence meant he'd covered his tracks in ways that no amount of evidence could untangle. That the veteran would probably credit the resident. That she'd disappear into the system like she'd never existed at all. Outside, the rain intensified. The parking garage echoed with the sound of water running in sheets, pouring down from the levels above, and Danielle pressed her head harder against the steering wheel until the plastic rim bit into her skull. She could wait. She was trained for waiting. She was trained for every scenario except this one, not survival, but irrelevance. Not combat, but erasure. She was still sitting there, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, unable to find the strength to even turn the key again, when the sound of rotor blades cut through the pre-dawn silence like a scream. The rotor wash shook the hospital windows like a violent prayer. 2 Black Hawks descended through the pre-dawn darkness, their searchlights cutting through the fog that clung to the ambulance bay, and the sound, that distinctive thud of helicopter blades, was the first thing that made Danielle's hands stop shaking. She didn't move from the parking garage. She didn't need to. The sound alone told her everything. She had heard those rotors before, in deserts where the ground turned red, and her body recognized them the way a drowning person recognizes a voice calling from the shore. The SEAL team commander came through the emergency room doors at 0 for 5 hours like a man walking through his own house. He didn't check in at the desk. He didn't look for a nurse or an administrator. He walked past the intake station with 3 operators flanking him, their uniforms immaculate, their bearing impossible to mistake, and he stopped in the center of the lobby where everyone could see him and spoke with the kind of authority that doesn't require volume. "I'm looking for Major Ross. Full name, call sign, combat history. I'm looking for her now." The night shift nurses froze. The resident stopped moving. The fluorescent light suddenly seemed too bright, too clinical for what was about to unfold. And then the veteran walked in behind them. He was still wearing the hospital gown over his bandaged chest, but someone had dressed him in his Class A dress uniform draped over the thin cotton fabric like armor pieced together from 2 different wars. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His ribbons were pinned in perfect rows: Bronze Star, Army Commendation Medal, Purple Heart, a small arms expert badge sewn beneath. He locked eyes with Danielle from across the lobby, and his jaw moved like he was testing the mechanics of speech after months of silence, and when he opened his mouth, the voice that came out sounded like gravel filtered through 30 miles of desert wind. Major. One word. His first word in 6 months. It hung in the air like a salute. Danielle stood. She didn't remember standing. Her legs moved without her permission, muscle memory overriding whatever remained of her conscious mind, and she walked across the lobby with the same measured pace she'd used in ICU bays and trauma rooms and on a street in Ramadi 20 years ago. The veteran extended a manila folder with the precision of a formal report being delivered to command. His hands, she noticed, didn't shake either. Inside the folder was a mission file, classified, redacted in places, but clear enough in the places that mattered. The 6-year-old boy had grown into a Delta Force operator. The mission report detailed the building collapse, the rescue, the 12 lives saved that day including his own. And there, documented in official Pentagon handwriting, was the reason he had been mute: combat trauma, selective mutism triggered by the same event, healed only by proximity to the person who had saved his life. The Surgeon General's recommendation sat on the final page. Silver Star. For combat heroism beyond duty. For saving lives under fire in a collapsed structure at 08 for 7 hours on a date Danielle had tried to forget for 2 decades. The SEAL commander's voice cut through the silence like a blade. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The entire lobby had stopped breathing. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. The words landed like rounds downrange. Purple Heart. Another pause. Longer this time. The residents were staring now, the night nurses were pulling out their phones, recording, understanding that something was happening that would never leave this place. Combat Medical Badge. 2 Purple Hearts. He turned to face the assembled staff directly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of official record. Major Danielle Ross, 75th Ranger Regiment, 3rd Battalion, Combat Support. 18 confirmed saves in theater. 2 hostage extractions. 3 citation commendations. And on the night of March 14th at this facility, performing emergency field thoracotomy under conditions that would have justified medical refusal, she saved a soldier who was abandoned by 5 doctors who cited administrative liability and psychiatric holds rather than honor their oath. That was when the FBI agents came through the doors. 2 of them, federal credentials already displayed, moving with the specific purposefulness of people executing a warrant. They didn't approach Danielle. They approached Dr. Ashford, who had emerged from the back office at the sound of the helicopters, drawn like a predator to a threat he suddenly recognized. His face had already begun to drain of color. The senior agent placed a hand on his shoulder, not aggressive, just final, and began reading him his rights in a voice that echoed through the lobby with television clarity. Dr. James Ashford, you're under arrest for prescription fraud, witness tampering, obstruction of medical care, and falsification of official medical records related to the March 14th incident involving patient Marcus Chen and staff member Major Danielle Ross. The second agent was already pulling documentation from a leather folder. We've been monitoring your controlled substance access for 18 months. Your diversion pattern is consistent with professional addiction, approximately 4,800 milligrams of oxycodone and fentanyl diverted monthly into your personal office. You altered electronic logs on the night of March 14th. You reassigned 2 witness nurses, Jessica Holland and Dr. Patricia Liu, to different floors within 6 hours of the emergency procedure. You fabricated insubordination complaints in Major Ross's personnel file dating back to her hire date, despite 0 prior complaints in her 77-month employment history. Dr. Ashford's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish suffocating in air. The white coat that had given him authority, that he had worn like a uniform, suddenly looked like a costume that had never fit. The agents removed it. They unsealed his hospital credentials. They recorded his badge number for permanent revocation. And as they walked him through the lobby, not dragging him, just escorting him with the inevitability of gravity. Every staff member they passed turned away. The nurses he had humiliated looked at their phones. The residents he had manipulated found sudden interest in the floor. The paramedics he had disrespected became invisible. No one made eye contact. No one spoke. The only sound was the shuffle of his shoes against the tile, the clink of handcuffs, the agent's voice finishing the recitation of charges. Danielle didn't watch him leave. She was looking at the veteran, Marcus Chen, the file said, the boy whose name she had never learned before today, and he was looking at her with the expression of someone who had been underwater for 6 months and had finally surfaced. The SEAL commander was explaining, his voice softer now, that Marcus had regained his speech the moment he heard her voice in the parking garage, that the neurologist said it was trauma resolution but Marcus said it was simpler than that. She had saved him when he was 6 years old, and her hand coming back into his life in a hospital room had completed something the wars had broken. The folder contained his statement, his mission history, his official record. It contained proof. 6 months later, Dr. Ashford walked into Seattle General Hospital wearing a gray security uniform with a name tag that read Night Staff, Parking Garage Division. He worked from 2100 to 0600, checking badges at the employees' entrance, walking the dark corridors, emptying trash from the supply closets and the offices of the staff he had once controlled through fear. The first night, he entered the closet where he had threatened Danielle about causing trouble. He found a coffee cup left behind, a patient folder, a pen someone had dropped. He took them to the incinerator in the basement. The night supervisor, a paramedic named Torres who had watched Danielle save the veteran's life, passed him without speaking. Then again on the next night. Then the next. After 3 weeks, Dr. Ashford requested a transfer to the parking lot, where fewer people would pass him. Management approved it. He checked badges now, and people looked away, and the justice of it, the specific, measured justice of it, was so precise that even his attorney didn't bother filing appeals. Danielle stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., 72 days after the Black Hawks landed, wearing her Class A dress uniform for the first time in 2 decades. The buttons, that frame was moved to her office at Walter Reed the next week. It hung on the wall behind her desk, visible to every combat medic, every corpsman, every nurse in transition who came to her office asking if their skills meant anything in the civilian world. Danielle would point to it without speaking, and they would understand. The quietest work saves the most lives, the invisible labor matters most, and sometimes the person refilling saline bags is actually holding entire wars together. The institution reformed slowly. Seattle General implemented new protocols for patient abandonment. The hospital board established oversight for controlled substances. 5 doctors, the ones who refused the mute veteran, were each required to complete ethics retraining and donate to a military trauma fund. But none of that mattered as much as the quieter change. The nurses started watching for the Dr. Ashfords, the ones who hid cruelty inside authority, and they stopped accepting the lie that speaking up meant destruction. They had seen Danielle stand silently while being humiliated, and they had seen what that silence contained, not weakness, but the discipline of a warrior waiting for her moment. So they started waiting too. On Danielle's first official day directing the VA trauma surgery program, a young paramedic named Jackson, 24 years old, 3 tours, trembling hands from what he wouldn't discuss, asked about the scars on her collarbone. Most staff deflected. Professional distance. Proper boundaries. But Danielle unbuttoned her collar and showed him the long line of scar tissue and asked if he wanted to know the story. He nodded. She told him about Ramadi, about the building, about the 6-year-old, about the years of silence. She told him about sitting in a parking garage not knowing her own name anymore. She told him that the scars never disappeared but they meant something. They marked the spaces where you had been broken and healed yourself back into someone who could help others break, and that was worth more than a medal on a ribbon. Jackson listened. Then he cried. Then he asked about the veteran from the hospital, and Danielle called Marcus that night from her office with Jackson sitting across from her, and Marcus told his own story, the silence, the moment she looked at him in the parking garage, the first word that came back when he saw her again. By the end of the call, Jackson was taking down the phone number for Walter Reed's mental health liaison. By the end of the week, he had enrolled in the long-term PTSD treatment program. By the end of the year, he was working with Danielle, training the next generation of combat medics, teaching them that survival was only the first part of the fight. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. That was the lesson the Pentagon learned from Danielle Ross. That was the lesson the doctors at Seattle General learned when they watched her stand in silence while being humiliated, and then watched her save a life that 5 of them had refused to touch, and then watched her career nearly destroy her for acting with honor. But most importantly, that was the lesson every combat medic who walked into her office learned, that their hands had value, that their training meant something, that the invisible work was the most important work, and that silence was not surrender, it was preparation. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please share this story. Subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments, would you have done what Danielle did, knowing it would cost you your career? Because every day, there are people like Marcus Chen, sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to see them. And every day, there are people like Danielle, standing quietly, ready to save them. The question is, are we brave enough to recognize heroism when it's wearing scrubs?